Romantic epistemology emerged from the Romantic challenge to both the static, materialist views of the Enlightenment and the contrary idealist stream when it came to studying life. Romanticism needed to develop a new theory of knowledge that went beyond the method of inertial science, derived from the study of inert nature, to encompass vital nature. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was at the core of the development of the new approach, both in terms of art and the science of knowledge itself. Coleridge's ideas regarding the philosophy of science involved Romantic science in general, but Romantic medicine in particular, as it was essentially a philosophy of the science of life. What is life? Were such a question proposed, we should be tempted to answer, what is not life that really is? Background: European thought had come through the scientific revolution concerning heaven and earth, and emerged, full of optimism about man's power of cognition, into the age of reason or Enlightenment. In facing the mystery of life itself, researchers first sought to apply the method that had worked so effectively for inertial nature to the realm of vital nature. In this approach, man himself was seen as a static entity and a tabula rasa onto which was written sense experience, considered as the source of all knowledge. Thus, life and knowledge were increasingly regarded from a mechanical and materialistic perspective. As William Godwin stated succinctly about the age, the human mind is nothing but a faculty of perception, that all knowledge comes from impression, and the mind starts with absolute ignorance. Quote, However, this approach faced a problem: the experience of a split between subject and object, the inner world of the mind and the outer world of things. This very real experience created a growing unease and doubt in Western philosophy regarding the reliability of sense experience as the basis for knowledge. Did what was perceived bear any true relationship to what was, or was perception simply at best a representation of reality and at worst an illusion? The epistemological dilemma arising from man's existential reality eventuated in two positions: materialism and idealism. The materialism of Hobbes elevated matter, and the sense experience of matter, to the level of sole reality, life being but an epiphenomenon. The contrary position of Hume was that the only reality man could be certain of was his inner experience of thoughts, of that reality was not objective, but a creation of the mind. The materialist position was combated initially by the works of the Cambridge Platonists, notably More and Cudworth, who set out to show how nature, man and the divine were connected through a plastic power that was accessible to the mind if it were approached rightly. Cudworth had challenged the rising tide of empiricism in his day by asserting that the universe was not composed merely of inert material atoms, governed by mechanical laws. Rather, the natural world was symbolic of a transcendent reality that lay beyond material appearances. The idealist position was challenged by the common-sense philosophy of Thomas Reid, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose ancestors came from the same part of Scotland as Reid, set out to rescue scientific knowledge from the idealism of Hume, while his critical analysis set the foundation for a more rigorous philosophy and science. His solution to idealism was to accept Hume's limits to human knowledge as well as the idea of a transcendent reality, but then to assert the legitimacy of natural science in delineating the reality of sense experience, and to operate as if what one perceived was indeed reality, an approach that served to save the appearances. Central role of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Romanticism was inspired by Kant's critical approach to the problem of knowledge, but rejected his limits to that knowledge, seeing it as confining the science of vital nature to the materialist approach, making life an epiphenomenon of the chance whirlings of unproductive particles. As Coleridge Coleridge put it succinctly, there was a profound feeling that a new epistemology, or science of knowledge, was needed to deal with the question of vital nature and the nature of life itself. Art, and in particular poetry, provided a vehicle to explore vital nature and to get to its essence. But for it to be scientific required an epistemological foundation. The central figure in the development of this epistemology was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This was recognized in his time, after his time, and even most recently. Certainly he stood athwart his age in many respects, and not least his seminal presence in the more ordered oeuvres of his friends and critics continues to grow. He was so seminal a thinker that his insights and epicas tend to sprout in the brains with a fertility that is positively dangerous. The influence of Coleridge, like that of Bentham, extends far beyond those who share in the peculiarities of his religious or philosophical creed. He has been the great awakener in this country of the spirit of philosophy, within the bounds of traditional opinions. He has been, almost as truly as Bentham, the great questioner of things established, for a questioner needs nor necessarily be an enemy. Coleridge was strongly influenced in his initial study of philosophy by Kant, but also from the reintroduction of Platonic thought via the Cambridge Platonists, particularly the discovery of Cudworth's History of Thought, and the ideas of Plotinus and Neoplatonism, not to mention the common-sense philosophy of Thomas Reid. The view of the mind as passive was challenged, as it seemed to leave no room for creativity and individuality. His own experience of creative powers of the mind, as experienced in and through poetry in particular, led him to seek out the role of imagination in human thought, and necessarily to distinguish it from fancy. Role of imagination. The meeting with Wordsworth in 1795 marked a turning point in Coleridge's thinking about thinking. In Wordsworth, Coleridge found a congenial mind, one that helped to foster the innate platonizing quality of his mind. This collaboration led to an enhancement of his own poetic creativity and the growth of his critical faculty. If Coleridge plunged impulsively into the Rubicon in 1795, it is equally clear that he emerged on the further shore in the late summer of 1802 and advanced directly on Rome with confidence and a firmly defined sense of mission. Coleridge went to Germany with Wordsworth in 1798–99, learned German and became more acquainted with German philosophy, both the Kantian stream and German idealism. Coleridge came to realize that the mind was not an associative faculty governed by blind mechanical laws, as Hartley's doctrine of mechanical association presented it, but rather was essentially a product of a creative shaping power that ruled perception and governed our mentation, but could also in its higher form be used to create new things, resulting in the evolution of consciousness and mind itself. Coleridge distinguished between imagination and fancy, which only fabricated illusions. For Coleridge, the creative capacity of the imagination, the prime agent of all human perception, was the key to connecting to the essence of things outside of ourselves and overcoming the apparent split between self and object occasioned by man's self-consciousness. The driving force of that connection and the activation of the creative imagination to get at the inherent essence of external objects was love, a deep desire to know other than ourselves. As Dorothy Emmett noted, the entire basis of Coleridge's new approach to knowing nature was that we should be able not only to look, but to love as we look, making philosophy and science a romantic endeavor. Relation of matter and sense experience to reality. For Coleridge, Western philosophy was intellect-bound and driven, containing no power of creative imagination, such as could be discerned in the Greek term nous, as expressed most maturely in Neoplatonic philosophy. Philosophy, for Coleridge, was scientia scientiarum, and critical to any advance in knowledge was its ability to go beyond a mere compilation of facts to the use use of the creative imagination to create a true epistemology, or the true and original realism. The final object and distinctive character of philosophy is this: for all that exists conditionally to find a ground that is unconditional and absolute, and thereby to reduce the aggregate of human knowledge to a system. Philosophy itself becomes the supplement of the sciences, both as the convergence of all to the common end, namely, wisdom, and as supplying the copula, which modified in each science in the comprehension of its parts to one whole, is in its principles common to all the sciences, as integral parts of one system, and this is method, itself a distinct science, the immediate offspring of philosophy, and the link immordant by which philosophy becomes scientific and the sciences philosophical. The office of philosophical disquisition consists in just distinction, while it is the privilege of the philosopher to preserve himself constantly aware that distinction is not the vision. In order to obtain adequate notions of any truth, we must intellectually separate its distinguishable parts, and this is the technical process of philosophy. But having so done, we must then restore them in our conceptions to the unity in which they actually coexist, and this is the result of philosophy. This capacity for seeing in a new light required a new capacity, and just as all the organs of sense are framed for a corresponding world of sense, so all the organs of spirit are framed for a correspondent world of spirit, so that the first principle of a true philosophy is to render the mind intuitive of the spiritual in man, that is, that which lies on the other side of our natural awareness from sense experience, and it is the sense world that derives from a higher supersensible world, not the converse as materialism would have it. I teach a real existence of a spiritual world without a material, but no matter without spirit. This world beyond the confines of space and time involved an ethereal element, by means of which individual entities, at base non-material, could communicate via the tremulous reciprocations of which propagate themselves to the inmost of the soul, and these tremulations operate on and between entities via one's deep desire that creates a circuit between subject and object, such that one has access via an inner organ and the corresponding philosophic or re-emergent Greek noetic organ. All knowledge for Coleridge rests on the coordination of subject and object, of the representation in the mind of a sense experience with the object itself, which can only occur where there is a connection between subject and object beyond pure sense experience, such that the thought that arises out of the mind's self-experience in the act of thinking produces not a representation but a phenomenon that is the reenactment in the mind of reality, and as such is knowledge that is apodictic, heuristic and hermeneutic all at the same time. Dual basis for the epistemology of life. Coleridge based his epistemology on two facts of experience, that of self and that of a world co-connected with self. Our being is something we can know intuitively and certainly, but the existence of things outside is less certain and subject to doubt, unless one acknowledges the world outside is not only coherent but identical, and one and the same thing with our own immediate self-consciousness, that is, that the experience of things without is a function of our experience of self. If we use only the intellect, we separate things that are not in reality separated, and this then gives only a knowledge of the outer appearances, termed in German Wissen, known as natural science. Upon irradiation from the noetic ideational capacity, however, this natural science of inert nature then becomes a useful means to render rational and analytical what is otherwise experienced only internally, as a private knowledge. The presupposition of material science of an objective world out there, separate from us, that causes sense experience and is then responsible for our thoughts and feelings, is replaced for Coleridge by the truest and most binding realism, that is grounded in a coeducation between subject and object, mediated by the creative imagination, a very real power of mind that reunites in the human mind above nature what is always united, but only separate by a prejudice of our mind due to our self-consciousness arising out of the self-awareness created by the mental capacity. Coleridge's true and original realism accepts that the object perceived is itself real and not an illusion of the mind. His human Kant would have it, but also that an object is inconceivable without a subject as its antithesis. Omen perceptum percipientum supponet. At the same time, the underlying principle of this realism can be neither subject or object, but that which unites the two, and this is a self-consciousness presence of mind thesis phi. This principle, characterized, manifests itself in the sum or ym, which I shall hereafter indiscriminately express by the words spirit, self, and self-consciousness. In this, and in this alone, object and subject, being and knowing, are identical, each involving and supposing the other. In other words, it is a subject which becomes a subject by the act of constructing itself objectively to itself, but which never is an object except for itself, and only so far as by the very same act it becomes a subject. Sense experience for Coleridge does not cause mind but is a means of revealing and evolving mind. As a result, being and thinking are not related as cause to effect, but as co-determinant. The principium essendi does not stand to the principium cognoscendi in the relation of cause to effect, but both the one and the other are co-inherent and identical. Self-conscious, being a self-contained principle, can then be made into a pure thought containing a polarity, with two opposite and counteracting forces, which is the minimum needed for motion, that then leads to self-discovery and the fullness of the human intelligence. If the intelligent faculty should be rendered more comprehensive, it would require only a different and apportioned organization, the body celestial instead of the body terrestrial, to bring before every human soul the collective experience of its whole past existence. Method: the means by which philosophy, or the general principles for seeking knowledge, is rendered into actual knowledge as science is method. Method involves the considered, thoughtful arrangement of parts that reflects the inner essence of things, and not simply their apparent association in space and time. This involves a preconception, a leading thought, Bacon's forethoughtful inquiry, or dry light, and a progressive transition, not a mere dead arrangement. But as without continuous transition there can be no method, so without a preconception there can be no transition with continuity. The term method cannot therefore, otherwise than by abuse, be applied to a mere dead arrangement, containing in itself no principle of progression. Coleridge uses the example of electricity, which had been known as an empirical fact for centuries, but it was not until science took on the organizing idea of polarity that rapid progress was made in revealing the nature and governing laws of this fact of nature. This is in contrast to magnetism, also known for centuries, but still unknown scientifically in his day as being still without an organizing idea. The naturalist, who cannot or will not see that one fact is often worth 1,000, as including them all in itself, and that it first makes all the others facts, who has not the head to comprehend this alter reverence. A central experiment or observation will never receive an auspicious answer from the oracle of nature. The fact of a relationship of parts to wholes derives from man's inherent experience of himself as apart from nature and yet somehow connected with it. The instinct, in which humanity itself is grounded, that by which, in every act of conscious perception, we at once identify our being with that of the world without us, and yet place ourselves in contradistinction to that world. The arrangement of parts must be into a consciously perceived real whole where the whole is in each of the parts, and is not merely the sum of the parts, or even greater or above the parts. Arranging the parts into the governing whole involves two forms of ordering or relations: ordination, or the hierarchical arrangement of discoveries using the leading thought, such as in medicine, physics and chemistry, and law, which is the correlative to the Platonic idea. In other words, idea and law are the subjective and objective poles of the same magnet, i.e., of the same living and energizing reason. What is an idea in the subject, i.e., in the mind, is a law in the object, i.e., in nature. Both determine the relation of the parts to the whole, and create the governing truth originating in the mind, and not abstracted or generalized from observation of the parts. There is divine or spiritual law and natural law, and between these two lies the laws governing human culture and the arts. For every work of the genius of man contains a necessary predominance of the ideas, and a comparative indifference of the materials. The goal of philosophy is to make systematic and conscious that which otherwise happens naturally, but unconsciously, namely access to the higher realm of idea and law, so as to then unfold through reason the various principles of application. Deep thinking is attainable only by a man of deep feeling, and all truth is a species of revelation. The development and progression of mind and consciousness from into this realm of what the Greeks termed wisdom and individual subconsciousness into the conscious mind is what Coleridge terms method. For this Coleridge is led to conclude that there is a functional polarity. The productive power, which acts in nature as nature, is essentially one with the intelligence which is in the human mind above nature. Given this self-organizing power in nature, form then follows function, or form is developed not from without but from within. While developing and once developed, it can be influenced from without, but its formative forces lie within and work outward. The correlative of this is that as the forms in all organized existence, so must all true and living knowledge proceed from within. Knowledge is a proper exercise of mind, not the blind, mechanical collation of data along some presumed criteria for ordering. As Coleridge wrote of Bacon, who he saw as misunderstood and misinterpreted, the truths which have the signatures in nature, and which may indeed be revealed to us through and with, but never by the senses, or the faculty of sense. Thus, the role of mind becomes paramount. Where in nature there are laws to keep everything in harmonious, dynamic whole, powered by a blind force, there must also be a similar force, but rational in essence, that works on and in man, what the Greeks termed the logos, and its executive organ, the nous. Coleridge sees two directions for the mind, outward and inward, reflecting the two givens of man's existence: the world out there, experienced through the physical senses, and the world in here, experienced through man's thinking capacity. The sense polarly contrasted with the inmost mind, a science which derives its name and character from the logos, as distinguished from the sense and from the nous. And in his essays on method, she, two forms of method, inseparably coexistent, quote, "If the artist copies the mere nature, the natura naturator, what idle rivalry? If he proceeds only from a given form, which is supposed to answer to the notion of beauty, what an emptiness, what an unreality there always is in his productions, as in Cipriani's pictures. Believe me, you must master the essence, the natura naturans, which presupposes a bond between nature in the higher sense and the soul of man. There is a method for discovering both. The sensibile world of nature out there, via simple desire to explore, and the supersensible world of man's thought activity within. In essence, as Coleridge says, the potential works in us even as the actual works on us. Coleridge challenged two basic assumptions of inertial science: the absolute dichotomy between mind and matter, or the severed outness of nature, and the assumption as fact, that physical nature has acted always and at all times the same. That is the assumption of a fixed outness of perceived objects. The first follows from the second, as uniformitarianism presupposes the fixed outness of appearances. However, as Coleridge understood, outness is not tenable philosophically or historically. For Coleridge, scientific method cannot be based on the absolute outness of things, but must involve accepting that an object as experienced is, in plain terms, the object itself, and that there is no other, and somehow still more objective, object lurking coyly behind it.